Our story starts off with our MC who was seen laying on the ground in an open field. But just then, he had heard a voice that called him by his name, which was Saojiro, telling him to wake up and also that he had laid in that field for far too long. At that moment, Saojiro didn't really think much of where the voice had come from, so out of instinct, he had just asked the voice to shut up and also not be so loud. At the same time, he stared at the sky while acknowledging that this was a world that was presumed to be one that suited him. Subsequently, he had sat up and noticed that there was absolutely nothing around him. Then in the next moment, he had heard that same voice again, which mentioned that it was surprised to see that he had finally woken up. At that moment, Saojiro was shocked to have heard a voice because he had previously acknowledged that he was the only one who was in that field. So still with that in mind, Saojiro had still gone on to look around him in hope to find the voice that he had just heard, but that was all no avail. Then in the next moment, the voice had alerted him to look down at his waist, so in the next moment, he had looked down and further wondered whether it could be his katana that was speaking the entire time. But after he had said that, the katana had told him that there was no need to guess, for it was him who had been speaking. At this point, Saojiro acknowledged that his treasured katana was able to speak to him, so in the next moment, he had hugged it while stating that he was so happy about it that he could die. However, the katana did well to remind him that he had already died once, for which Saojiro had acknowledged with a smile on his face. Following that, Saojiro stated that if he could remember correctly, the god of his former world had wanted to use the data in his soul, so for that reason, he had sent Saojiro to another world. At that time, God had told him that he would only let him bring things that he could hold in his hands, so with that in mind, he had chosen one of the katanas that were nearby. Then in the next moment, Saojiro had mentioned to the katana that it was an absolute pleasure to meet him and at the same time, had given the katana a temporary name of Love Katana. In response to that, the katana remarked saying that was a really boring name, so in the next moment, he went on to introduce himself to Saojiro as Hatarumaru, but Hataru was a nickname that he could call him by. Just as he had said that, Saojiro acknowledged the katana Hatarumaru was apparently a national treasure that had been created in the Nanboku-cho area, and at the same time was lost in the Pacific War. So with that, Saojiro held Hataru up into the air while stating that he had really hit the jackpot with something from the area of Naboku-cho. Then in the next moment, Hataru stated that Saojiro had apparently swung him for more than 3 years, so it was kind of weird that he couldn't even recall his name. With that being said, Saojiro asked Hataru whether he knew his own name, so without even waiting for a reply, he had introduced himself to Hataru as Fujinami Asujiro, and subsequently stated that he would be happy if he could call him Saoji. After that, Hataru remarked saying that was a good name, and also that he hoped that Saoji was going to take good care of him, for which Saoji had calmly replied telling Hataru to take care of him as well. Following that, Saoji noticed that he had another small katana on his waist, so he went on to wonder if that one had a name of its own. Similarly, Hataru reasoned that it was a fairly young sword, so he was assuming that it may not have developed any language skills, so if it didn't have a name, Hataru suggested that Saoji just gave it a name, so in the next moment, Saoji had grabbed it while saying that the little katana's name would now be Sakura. Following that, Saoji assumed that it was only the 3 of them in that world, so with that being said, so suggested that they all just did their best to help each other out. Hataru then acknowledged that Saoji was as calm as usual, and subsequently, he went on to ask him whether he had any other interests, besides katanas like girls, for which Saoji had confidently given a positive response. So following that, Hataru was really happy to hear this, but putting that aside, he also went on to state that for now, Saojiro would have to decide where he wanted to go and what he wanted to do. So in response to that, he acknowledged that for now, they should be on the move no matter what. Just then, Saoji noticed a forest that was behind him, so he remarked saying that if he had the option to choose his direction, he would do everything in his power to avoid that forest, for which Hataru had asked him why he had said such a thing. Following that, Saoji explained that he had said that because he didn't really know much about the ecosystem of that world, so until he was knowledgeable of the area, he figured that he would avoid places where strange things may live. Then in the next moment, Hataru had mentioned that even though Saoji's face didn't show it, it seemed that she thought about it appropriately, so for now, Hataru had suggested that they should just try heading up that hill, and figured that if Saoji had a large enough view, he might be able to find something. So with that being said, Saoji had began his journey up the hill. As he walked, he remarked saying that the air somehow tasted really good, and at the same time, his body felt really light. After a minute of his journey, he began to realize that he had never felt that alive on Earth before. Just then, he noticed a white flash of light in a distance and went on to wonder what it could possibly be, for which Hataru had stated the obvious by saying that he would know if he went there. Saoji then continued to walk, but before he knew it, he had reached the top of the hill within no time. After which, he had remarked saying that he was really glad that he didn't go into the forests. Just then, Hataru drew attention to a crossroad that they had reached. There was a sign which indicated different areas and their direction, and the moment Saoji had saw them, he realized that he had never seen the characters of that language before, but somehow, he was still able to read them. With that being said, Hataru had suggested that they should obviously go to the right. Saoji didn't think of that to be a bad idea. However, the main problem with that suggestion was the fact that they didn't know exactly how long it would take to get there, but despite that, he had still chosen to go to the town of Makaria. About an hour later, Saoji followed the rift path, and after a while, he remarked saying that he didn't see anything that resembled that of a town. Subsequently, he stated that if he were to continue walking for any longer, he would definitely die. So with Saoji having said that, Hataru had mentioned that unlike he and Sakura who didn't require food, Saoji was still a human being who seldom required it. Hataru further stated that even if Saoji were to go into the forest in search of some food, in the end, he might just end up eating something really strange, although that was just a possibility, and there was still a chance that he went in there and ended up actually finding something good to eat. However, he still had a little strength left over, so he figured that he'd just walk a little more. At the same time, he figured that he would continue down the road that avoided the forest because the forest still seemed dangerous at that point. Just then, Hataru alerted Saoji and asked him whether he could also hear someone screaming in the distance. As he ran into the forest, Hataru advised him that he should just continue following that same road, and once he was to reach the turn, he should even able to see it. At this moment, Saoji noticed that the road that was opposite to him seemed to be the only one that left the forest, which would also seem to be a great attacking point. Just then, Saoji had spotted a caravan that was nearby, so the moment they saw it, Hataru had urged him to crouch down so that he wouldn't be seen. From the looks of it, there seemed to be a lot of people around the carriage, so subsequently, Hataru had suggested that they snuck up on the caravan to observe the situation. It was then observed that a group of guys dressed in head bandanas who had surrounded a busty girl, beautiful girl. Then in the moment, one of them had mentioned that he wanted to forcefully form an exclusive contract with him, but his boss had told him to shut the fuck up and also not get too close to her. Just then, as Saoji listened to this, it was made aware to him that the woman was an acolyte. In the next moment, Hataru proposed to Saoji that he should try looking into the caravan through the small hole. After that, he was shocked to see a man who was doing some really weird stuff with a girl that was killed with a knife to her throat. And with that, Saoji had a really terrified look on his face. In the next moment, Hataru then went on to say that even though that guy in the caravan was a small fry, killing him silently would still definitely be difficult. But even with that, Hataru went on to ask Saoji whether he was still going to do it, for which Saoji had given a positive response. Subsequently, Hataru stated that he understood that Saoji would first of all have to kill the guy in the caravan quickly, then after that, without letting them question him, he would need to quickly close the distance between them. And lastly, Hataru stated that it would be best if Saoji beheaded as many of them as he could, and at the same time, he mentioned that he would be able to let him know if there were any enemies behind him. So first, Saoji went on to take an offensive stance, and also lower the angle of his blade by a small amount. Following that, he was urged to take half a step to the right, so as to make Saoji's distance 1 meter, and his usage distance to be 2 meters. Then in the next moment, Saoji had made use of his blade to behead the creepy dude in the van. Following that, Hataru stated that as expected of Saoji, he was easily able to kill an enemy without changing a heartbeat, which led to believe that he must have definitely experienced real combat before. After that, he come out of the caravan and went up behind the group of guys, after which, he had swiftly sprinted towards them. The girl that was being tormented saw Saoji as he approached, and with that, Saoji really didn't raise her voice in surprise. Then in the next few seconds, he had run up to them and proceeded to behead the men one after the other, and this girl had gotten a front row seat to this. And after all that, the girl had hid behind him while Saoji had subsequently acknowledged that he had only 2 more enemies to kill. Flashback to Saoji's previous life. Fujinami Asajiru was 16 years of age when he had formerly died, and apparently, the cause of his death was a stab wound, however, and at the same time, he had killed 2 robbers at the time without hesitation. It was quite evident that Saoji had changed just a little bit, a long time ago, and it was something that resided in his heart ever since he was little. In fact, There was an instance where a criminal had been reported to have been sentenced to prison for life, but at the situation, as a baby, he wondered why they hadn't just killed him to begin with, which was an excessively cruel judgment for a baby to have. To him, heinous individuals were things and not people, though Saojiru's deviated sense of values didn't hinder his daily life at all. With that, he lived with a constant feeling of estrangement. Now back to the present. The two guys who were left over during the ambush Saoji had started. One of the guys had a shaky voice while telling his comrade that they should both just escape while they still had the chance, for which the comrade confidently replied saying that as vexing as it was, it didn't seem that they would be able to beat Saoji. So with that in mind, they would just have to make a run for it. Apparently, the guy who just spoke was the vice chief of their gang. So with that in mind, he told his comrade to hold on for a second and that they would soon escape together. But they needed to formulate a plan because it was quite obvious to him that Saoji would catch them if they just ran like that. In the next moment, the vice chief had thrown his comrade on the ground in an attempt to serve as a distraction. Then in the next moment, he began to make a run for it. As he ran away, Saoji asked the girl he had rescued there was any need to let these hoodlums remain alive, for which she confidently replied saying that there was no need to leave even a single one of them alive. So with that being said, Saoji had sprinted towards the vice chief and went on to pierce him right through the chest with his sword. After that, the last guy who was left overlaid on the ground while begging for mercy as Saoji approached him. After hearing his pleads, he went on to ask the girl what she thought about sparing him, for which she had replied and recalled the moment where that same guy had killed a husband and wife despite how much they had begged for their lives. So with that being said, Saoji had stabbed him right through the throat. After this whole encounter, Saoji went on to inquire about how Hotaru was doing, for which he charismatically replied saying that he had done an A+ job in battle. Saoji was flattered to hear this, so he went on to thank Hotaru while saying that he was only able to fight without worrying because of him. In the next moment, the girl he had saved looked at him and almost thought he was crazy for talking to his sword like that. And in that moment, Hotaru had urged to keep his cool because he knew that Saoji didn't seem to be that cool with the ladies. Then in the next moment, the girl had asked Saoji what he was going to do with the robbers' weapons. At that point, Saoji hadn't really given it much thought. So subsequently, he stated that he didn't think of it to be that bad of an idea to sell them. In the next moment, as Saoji searched around for Sakura, he had found her planted in the face of one of the robbers. He then picked Sakura up while hugging and apologizing to her for having stabbed her into one of those dirty low lives. After a while, Saoji had brought out all the weapons they had gathered and Saoji went on to acknowledge that these were the weapons that they had collected. And at the same time, he had searched their bodies, but apparently they were so broke that they didn't have any money on them. After this, Saoji went on to ask this girl what they should now do with the weapons and went on to suggest that he just use some for himself. The girl then stated that she had this thought earlier, so she went on to ask him whether it could be possible that he didn't know the rule about weapons. She sensed that Saoji was really confused about this, so she went on to explain that he wouldn't be able to use a weapon's intrinsic abilities unless he was registered as its owner. At the same time, a weapon was basically an identification card, and a criminal weapon could equally be turned in for a reward. The moment she had explained it, Saoji understood that this basically meant that a weapon wouldn't be able to hurt anyone if it wasn't equipped. Subsequently, the girl stated that they should most likely move away from that spot for the moment, for it was only a matter of time before the magical beasts followed the scent of blood that had now spread over everywhere. After she had said that, Saoji remarked saying that he wasn't surprised at the fact that magical beasts existed there. Following that, the girl had smiled while stating that she acknowledged that she might have been a little rude by not telling her his name. So in the next moment, she had introduced herself to him as Sistine, and after that, she didn't well to thank him again for helping her through that dangerous situation. Following that moment, Sistine had gone on her knees to pay her last respects to the nobles who had been killed by those robbers, and in the same moment, she remarked saying that she and the nobles hadn't been traveling together for that long. But still, she still felt a strong attachment to them. Saoji then looked at the ground while apologizing to her and subsequently stating that they would have been alive if only they had arrived any sooner. Sistine urged him not to beat himself up about it because after all, she was still currently alive because he had saved her. And with that, they now returned the nobles' belongings back to their families. With that being said, Saoji went on to wonder whether this world was one where only a few belongings, if any, were returned back to their families. However, Sistine had then suggested that they head towards Mikarin, a town which was the closest one from there. Then as they rode in the caravan together, Saoji acknowledged just how beautiful Sistine was, and at the same time, he had proceeded to admire the giant watermelons that she had on her chest. They rode until the sun had set, so at that point, Sistine had suggested that they camped at the spot they had stopped at for the night. Then in a couple of hours, they both were famished, so Sistine had made use of the resources she had available to prepare some dinner. So in the following moments, she had informed Saoji that the food was ready. However, she had cooked with the ingredients they only had on hand. Saoji took a look at the bowl and realized that back in his old life, their maid would usually make him that in Japan. Saoji drank the soup and proceeded to have flashbacks of the most significant events of his life, and after that, he had proceeded to cry heavily. Sistine saw this and began to apologize to him while assuming that the soup was so bad that it had caused him to cry. Saoji then replied saying that wasn't quite the case. Having that in mind, he went on to explain that this was just the first time that he had ever eaten a meal that was so delicious. So in the next moment, Sister Na had thanked him for the compliment. As Saoji had tears in his eyes, he informed Sistine that didn't really know anything about that world. So with that being said, he went on to ask her whether she would be able to teach him everything about that world. Sistine was surprised to hear that he had asked her to explain the things of that world, so she subsequently stated that even if he were to ask her to explain it, she wouldn't know where to start and also how to go about it. Saoji understood this, so he further suggested that they both started by introducing themselves. That way, they would be able to get to know more about each other. After stating that, he had asked her what she thought about that idea. She thought of this to be a good idea, and subsequently she recommended that she showed him just how exactly the personal identification worked. After that statement, she uttered the word display, and a status window had appeared in front of her. And at that moment, he was totally and utterly shocked to see a status window that had just appeared out of nowhere. But he still mentioned that he didn't really understand how it worked at the same time. However, he was still able to read it even though he had never seen those characters before. Saoji then acknowledged that this was all thanks to one of the 3 skills that so-called God had so graciously granted him, which was language, literacy, and convenient studying, and with what he had seen so far, it seemed like among those 3, it was the literacy that proved to be the most useful. So Saoji then took a look at her status screen and was amazed at all the different skills she was capable of performing. He looked a little further and noticed one of her skills to be the art of lovemaking, and went on to assume that it was the kind of late-night bed type of skills. Just the thought of this pleased him, so he went on to reason that Sistine would definitely make a great maid. Sistine then noticed that Saoji was able to read her status skills, and at that instant, she had a really red blush on her face because she was surprised as to how he was able to read it even though it was encrypted, for which Saoji had apologized for reading without her consent while scratching his head with an awkward smile. At the same moment, Saoji figured that this was somehow God's power at work because he was always going to be literate no matter what the script was. Sistine then sighed while asking Saoji whether he would be so kind as to show her his own window. Saoji replied saying he didn't have any problem with that. However, he didn't really know how to, so he went on to ask her to kindly show how he could open his own status window. So after Sistine she agreed to this, she leaned towards him while telling him that in order to open up his window, he would need to turn his perception onto himself, and afterward chant the word display. In the next moment, Saoji had done exactly as she had instructed him, and after this, to Saoji's surprise, his very own status screen had appeared right before his very eyes. He went through the screen and observed his job was Magic Swords Master, which he found to be quite cool for himself. Then after he had studied it for a while, Sistine had asked Saoji whether it would be fine if he took a little at his screen, for which he had immediately agreed to. Following that moment, given the permission, Sistine proceeded to study the information carefully on his screen. And as that went on, out of boredom, Saoji had tried touching the status screen to see what would happen, and to his surprise, that act had made it disappear. In the next moment, Sistine had asked Saoji of his name, so he did well to introduce himself to her. Now that she was aware of his name, she went on to ask him whether he knew what kind of work an acolyte did. But even before he could give a response to that question, Saoji reasoned that the word acolyte was quite similar to the word priest. However, the abilities that she had didn't really explain enough to him. At this same moment, he recalled that she had the skill named the art of lovemaking, which made him having double thoughts about what an acolyte did. In the following moment, he further reasoned that Sistine looked all prim and proper to him, but during the night, he just assumed that she would turn into a freak. A lot of time had passed with him not answering her question, so she let off a light cough which had brought his attention back and told her that he was unaware of the job of an acolyte. So with that being said, she had offered to explain it to him. To Saoji, Sistine's explanation was easy to understand but at the same time really long as hell. Therefore, He had tried to summarize it more to the point because his brain wasn't capable of holding that amount of information. Sistine had explained that at some temple, exceptionally gifted people were really raised to be fighting maids or something like that apparently. And among the acolytes, she had mastered 3 of the key abilities, which was Guardian, Restoration, and Negotiation, which in turn made her a Master Acolyte. When she had become a Master Acolyte, she was granted with the special abilities in the form of an X skill. So with that being said, she was aware that it was a really important skill. So being honest, she really wanted to keep it hidden. Then after she had explained this, Saoji began to understand and get a clearer idea of what she was saying. Sistine also mentioned that acolytes did have a particularly sought-after skill which was known as contract. This meant that an acolyte that was bound to a person by a contract must fulfill absolutely any order from them, or else a cumbersome punishment would be imposed on them. But in return, the acolyte's prowess would dramatically increase, which would make them more able to fight. This power was potent, but would only manifest under a contract. Apparently, the Mrs. and Mr. had donated a large amount to the temple. They did that to get the rights to have them form a contract with their son. That incident had left in a state where she was not contracted to anyone, which was why at that time, she was attacked for not having the contract skill active. However, if they were to have attacked her, she would have just used her self-defense skill to kick their asses accordingly. But with all this being said, she acknowledged that she couldn't even use her own power to save someone because she wasn't allowed to. After she had narrated all this, Saoji recalled that it was true that Sistine was the only one without a single scratch. But to be unable to save people that were being killed before her very eyes was a bit concerning to him. Sistine then replied saying that she what Saoji was going to say, so she stated that even in a situation like that, her acolytes still couldn't move. After which, she wholeheartedly stated that acolytes could only use their power when performing their job via contract. But breaking that law would in turn make the acolyte lose their power, so she reasoned that if she were to lose that power, she would end up not being able to save anyone. Following that statement, Sistine had said to Saoji that she thought of him to be a really unique person because when she saw his battle window, she didn't see any battle-type abilities. But despite that, he was capable of moving so well. At the same time, she also acknowledged that Saoji's job was a magic swords master. However, she herself had absolutely no knowledge of what that job was in the first place. At that point, Saoji felt he was screwed because he didn't really have any knowledge of his own skills, for it had been God that just gave it to him. So he shyly replied saying that it was entirely possible that she would see a job that she was unaware of every now and then. Following that moment, she had leaned towards his body and asked whether he had ended up seeing her magical ability. He heard this and immediately thought she was referring to the art of lovemaking, but later realized that obviously couldn't be it, so went on to state that it was the wisdom script skill. Thereafter, she explained how the skill worked by saying that if she were to think about wanting to know something she saw, the skill would grant her some of the knowledge regarding that thing. And at the same time, if it was just a single word he was looking into, the wisdom script would give her almost complete knowledge of the topic. Subsequently, she mentioned that normally, Saoji's skill was known as Magi Swordsman. But in Saoji's case, his status screen read Magic Swords Master. Also, he also had the abilities that blacksmiths have. Following that, she acknowledged that he also had a special ability which was convenient understanding. So with that being said, he went on to ask her whether she should try it out. As he used it, he remarked saying that information was flowing straight into her head. He then took a look at a nearby cart and subsequently began to state some facts about that particular cart. So with that being said, Sistine had stated that it appeared to be just like her wisdom script skill. After that, she went on to ask him whether he had ever tried his arms expert skill, for which he replied saying that he hadn't tried it out yet, but would do so now that she had asked. He initiated it and was shocked to discover that Hataru was a rank S magic weapon with several god tier specs. Sistine was also amazed by this, so she went on to acknowledge that his weapon was of divine weapon class, and what was more interesting to her was the fact that her wisdom script skill wasn't even working on it. Subsequently, Saoji had discovered that Sekiro was a pretty good sword as well with an absorption value of 47. Sistine was confused as to what this absorption value was, so she went on to ask Saoji, for which he had replied saying that there was something more important than that alternate state, which was the animate skill that could be used on Hataru. In the following moments, Saoji had held Hataru while informing him that he wished to make use of the animate technique since he was so curious about it. Hataru understood this and instructed Saoji to draw him and place him in the null space that was beside him, for which he had duly followed the instructions. So in the next moment, Hataru had transformed into a hot girl who literally had a lot on her chest. In that moment, Sistine was shocked to see that a weapon had actually transformed into an actual person, for which Saoji was equally happy, but not for that reason, rather for the fact that she was bare naked. Although Sistine was surprised, she had acknowledged Hataru's nudity and told Saoji that they should at least get her something to wear first, for which Hataru stated that was really unnecessary, and subsequently asked Saoji to hand her the sheath that was on the ground near her. This sheath she referred to was just the case of the katana she formerly was, so with that being said, Saoji had given it to her, and she had made it transform into a fairly revealing but decent gown, for which she stated would suffice for the moment. Thereafter, Saoji had embraced Hataru, and as they hugged, Saoji's face was planted on her chest while he got a face full of watermelon, and at the same time, Hataru reasoned that having a human body was truly a magnificent thing. Saoji also reasoned that being able to connect with Hataru like this really filled him with joy. Then in the next moment, she had stated that from there on out, they both would be connecting in the truest form that a man and woman could. The fact that Hataru had said that they both would be connecting in the truest form that a man and woman could. Saoji and Sistine had red blushes on their faces as they wondered what this could have possibly meant. After that, Hataru had used her sword to touch Saoji's banana tree, and realized that just from hearing those words, he had gotten himself bricked up. So with that just happening, Saoji had fallen to the ground while he told Hataru not to tease him like that, all with an embarrassed look on his face. Now that that was over, Hataru went on to state that she would be keeping watch for the night, so both Saoji and Sistine should get some rest. In the following moment, Sistine had drawn Saoji's attention and told him that she had something really important to talk about with him. Saoji then thought that it sounded pretty concerning considering the fact that it was something that they couldn't talk about at the moment, for which she had replied saying it was indeed something that they was unable to talk about at the moment. She then stated that she had to resolve herself, so she would like a night to think over it. Then as Saoji laid down to rest, he was having a pretty much sleepless night because he wondered what the important thing that Sistine wanted to talk about could be. He then went on to wonder whether it could be possible that she wanted them both to go their separate ways after that night. This thought made Saoji almost restless because he really didn't want that to happen. Just then, Hataru had appeared beside Saoji and went on to ask him about what had made him look so troubled. Saoji didn't reply this question directly but had rather just taken a peek of Sistine as she slept. Hataru really didn't understand that but just went on to assume that he was having trouble sleeping because of the bunch of things that had happened. She placed his head on her chest while she acknowledged that he had lost his life and was subsequently thrown into this world. And then the incident with the bandits wasn't the most flattering experience. Following that, she had gone on to ask Saoji about just how much people he believed he had killed, including in his former world, for which he coldly replied saying that he had never counted and all he did after all was just cut up some bad people he referred to as things. Hataru got closer to him and informed him that in his original world, it may have been in his self-defense, but he had still killed 2 people, and among them, one of the people he killed happened to be his biological father. Saoji then acknowledged that the person he killed was indeed his father, but in the end, he was having trouble with money and just decided to break into his ex-wife's house. No matter what he was feeling, he had ended up stabbing his own son. So with that being said, Hataru went on to ask him whether that was the main reason that he had killed him, for which Saoji replied giving a positive response while saying that if he hadn't killed him, he would have stolen something that was very valuable. Now that Hataru understood this, she went on to ask Saoji for the permission to sleep together with him. At the same time, she stated that there was absolutely no reason to worry about keeping watch, because after all, it was really quite outside. Then in the next moment, she had mounted herself on top of Saoji, and at that same instant, she sensed that Saoji's heart rate had increased, so she had then asked him whether he preferred not to sleep with her, for which Saoji had hesitantly replied saying that it's not as if he were against it. It's just that he was a little flustered by this. Hataru further stated that while she was still in the form of a sword, Saoji had held her so tenderly every night. So with that in mind, they had basically always slept together this entire time. With all this being said, they both proceeded to act out an erotic scene from the average PG-18 rated movie, and after that, they both had laid in bed, and while Saoji slept, Hataru was aware that Sistine was awake and observed them the entire time. So in the next moment, she went on to ask her whether she also thought that Saoji was a really interesting man. Sistine was surprised to hear that Hataru knew that she was awake this entire time. Sistine further stated that Saoji had always felt loneliness, and at the same time, His stance on evil differed from that of most people, which was why this world was a serious necessity for him because it was one that accepted everything. And also, he was a partner who was willing to accept everything as well. So after Sistine had heard all this, she remarked saying that Saoji was truly amazing, which she said while sitting up from her bed. So at that point, Hotaru had reasoned that it appeared that Sistine had now resolved herself after all. The next morning, while Saoji was busy readying some materials, Sistine had walked up to him and mentioned that she had come to bring him some water. At that moment, Saoji was really confused as to why she would do that. But before he could question her about it, Sistine had asked Saoji whether he would like to form a contract with her. After she had asked him this, let us recall an instance where acolyte Sistine had several families on their knees begging for her to form a contract with them. Apparently, there was this family that had come to her one day and had offered her their entire family's fortune, just so that she would form a contract with their son, which was a sure indicator that a contract from her was something really precious. Then in the next moment, as they kneeled before Sistine, she had urged them to raise their heads, and subsequently stated that she would establish the contract. Back to the present, Saoji was a bit confused as to why she wished to form a contract with him in the first place. So following that, he had gone on to ask to her why she had made such a sudden decision. Immediately he asked that question. Sistine went on to recall the PG movie that he and Hotaru had acted out the previous night, so not wanting to make it obvious, she had stated that she had simply decided to do it because she felt that it was fate. She further stated that if the Lord and Mrs. had never visited the temple, she would still be working in the temple, and if things had happened that way, the Lord and Mrs. wouldn't have died, and with that, Saoji wouldn't have come to her rescue either. But in reality, the Lord had come to her rescue But in reality, the Lord had come to the temple, then brought her back with him. And at the same time, some bandits who had witnessed this had attacked and took everyone's lives except for her. Sistine acknowledged that she could have ended up being forced to form a contract with one of those bandits, but instead, she had been saved by Saoji. In the next moment, Sistine had a red blush on her face while she reminded Saoji that he formerly spoke of wishing to know more about that world, so she let him know that she possessed knowledge of her wisdom script skill, and at the same time, she stated that she hated holding memories such as those because she had strength, but could not protect the people she wished to protect. In the next moment, Saoji understood this and had a bright smile on his face while he stated that he was looking forward to being with her from now on, and let her know that he would be happy to form a contract with her. Sistine was really happy about this, so she had a bright smile on her face while she stated that she was forever grateful to him for all he had done for her. So with all that being said, Sistine had begun the contract ritual, and as it held, she explained that there were employment, master-servant, and son-servants type of contracts. Each contract was progressively stronger in the order it had been listed. Also, the stronger the constraints the contract held, the stronger the acolyte's abilities would become. And to test it out, many first make a contract of employment with their acolyte before creating a more permanent contract, all just to get a feel of how things would be. However, the most practical one was the contract of master-servant because within its contents was an exception clause that allowed a method to add more contracts. Saoji thought about this and reasoned that subservience one's color was really wonderful, and also kind of ominous. Thereafter, Sistine added that in other words, the subservience could be seen as a contract of unconditional obedience, and basically, it could be construed as an enslavement contract. Then in the next moment, Saoji had shown Sistine the contract paper and urged her to overwrite and rewrite the condition of unconditional obedience to the master's orders while permitting her a one-time authority to decline. He further stated that an acolyte and the said acolytes were to be used for and only for the master. Upon breaching this rule, the acolyte would lose their power, so with that being said, he stated that everything from there shall be deleted. However, at times when the acolyte Sistine dictates it necessary, for her own justice and responsibility, it was authorized that she could use her power as she saw suitable. Sistine was shocked by this and went on to ask why he had rewritten the contract as he pleased. And at that point, she was even more shocked because no one should be capable of doing that. With that in mind, she went on to state that an acolyte's contract was absolute because it could not be altered, and also because an acolyte's power could only be used for the contractor. An acolyte must indeed be prudent, only selecting a master deemed worthy of their service. After hearing this, Saoji was flattered to see that this was the way that she felt about him, so that in mind, he went on to thank her, after which, Sistine had a red blush on her face. In the next moment, Saoji had opened his status screen and mentioned that how he rewrote the contract should have been apparent to her since she had seen his abilities. So with that being said, he went on to show her that it was his language literacy skill that had helped him to do so. Following that, he explained that he could understand every possible word and conversation. At the same time, he could read and write everything possible. At least that was what he assumed the skill was capable of doing. This assumption was precisely why he had thought that he would be able to rewrite the contract. And fortunately for him, when he tried it, it had worked. This statement made Sistine chuckle with a red blush on her face while stating that he was honestly just too charming. At the same time, she reasoned that she must have trained to become an acolyte in order to meet a man like Isekai'd. Subsequently, she recalled that acolyte training was arduous, and every day since she was a young girl, that had practiced magic and studied really hard in order to have done everything perfectly. Then at that point, she realized that it was all for this day, where she would meet someone that she could offer her everything to. Subsequently, Sistine had placed her hand on her system and said to it that she acknowledged Isekai'd as her master. There was a mild explosion, and following that, she informed him that the contract forming had been completed, so from now on, she would serve him as an acolyte. Then with a disturbed face, he had replied saying that it was his pleasure. In the next moment, Hotaru had asked him why he couldn't have a much more jubilant face, for which he replied saying that he had Hotaru, Sekira, and now he had also gotten to meet Sistine. So with that, he reasoned that being blessed with such good luck, it made him worry that all that laid ahead would be bad things. Immediately this was said, Hotaru and Sistine let off really light chuckles, and in the following moment, Hotaru mentioned that he should think of it that he had been blessed by this world. Then Isekai'd realized that there wasn't really much of a point to worrying about it, so he had agreed to what Hotaru had said. At the same time, he remarked saying that he didn't really know about this world, for which Sistine was aware of, so she urged him to leave it all up to her. Just then, Isekai'd realized that the amount of power he had upon Sistine, so she urged her to call him master from there on out, for which Sistine had instantly complied to. Then in the next moment, Isekai'd realized that was totally uncalled for and also that he had begun to get ahead of himself, so he went on to apologize to Sistine while telling her that she could just call him by his name Isekai'd. However, Sistine didn't really think of it to be that bad of an idea, so she suggested that they both had a compromise, which was that she would address him as Saojiru and master when others were around. So in exchange, she pleaded with him to let her address him as master at all other times. In response to that, Isekai'd stated that he didn't really care what he called him, and at the same time, he told her that she also didn't need to speak so formally with her all the time, for which she had replied saying yes master. Then as they sat in a caravan, Sistine went on to ask him what they would be doing from there on out and also whether he had some sort of goal along the lines. After he heard that question, he acknowledged that the role God appointed to him was to simply live his life in this world. So with that in mind, he told Sistine that he didn't really have a specific goal, for he only wanted to find some place to peacefully live out his life and earn a living. He further stated that if he could live honestly to himself, that would be enough. Following that, he stated that if Sistine was there with him, that would make it all a lot more fulfilling. After all, Sistine stated that by reverse logic, this meant that Isekai'd could give his all to any goal from there on out, and also, from there on out, he could be anything that he wanted to be. In response to this, he asked her to stop flattering him and also that she was thinking a little too highly of him. Then in the next moment, Isekai'd had spotted a town nearby, so he drew their attention towards it. Shortly after, they arrived in the city where Isekai'd acknowledged that it was a packed place, and as they walked, he remembered that Sistine had a talk with the entrance guard before they had entered the city, so he went on to ask her what that was all about. So in response to that, she stated that normally, they would need to pay some amount of money before they would be able to get into the city. But if you were to show them that they were acolytes and master, then they would be exempted from paying that. After he heard this, Isekai'd remarked saying that acolytes were truly amazing. But just as he said that, Sistine mentioned that in exchange for this privilege, they would have a duty to attend to. The moment he heard this, he went on to assume this meant that they would have worked for the city or some time of that sort. But Sistine told him that wasn't quite the case and would give him the full details next time they could relax, after which, she had stated that even if she had a duty to attend to, she wanted to get into the city free no matter what. Hotaru then crossed her arms while she felt a little displeased that they had done that because they were short on money, so with that in mind, she remarked saying that she probably should have hunted and skinned more monsters so that she would be able to sell them for a high price. Subsequently, Sistine mentioned all that wouldn't be necessary because they could just get enough money from selling the skins and the rewards from taking out the bandits. However, in the next moment, Sistine had a guilty look on her face while she mentioned to Isekai'd that she wished to ask him for something. At that same moment, she reasoned that asking Isekai'd to send some money to the family of her late master would be very selfish of her. So with that in mind, She felt that she would just tell Saoji not to worry about it, but before she could even explain or say anything about it, Saoji had wholeheartedly agreed to it. Sistine was shocked as to why he had agreed so abruptly because she hadn't even told him anything about it yet, for which he had replied saying that he knew that if she had such a sad look on her face while she asked him for something, there was no way that she could say no to him because she was his friend after all, after which he went on to assume that she wanted to do something for her former master, so he stated that they would only take what they need and send the rest. He further stated that the properties that the bandits had would be given to the quest taker, so as such, all these properties would be given to her. However, Sistine acknowledged that if she were to send them, it would feel like they were taking the reward for the request. But in response to that, so at that point, she had thought to herself and remarked saying that she was really happy to have formed a contract with someone like him. A couple of minutes later, they had arrived at a merchant's shop, where Sistine had asked whether it would be possible to sell their carriage. Then as the merchant analyzed the merchandise, Sistine had boldly asked him to kindly name his price. The merchant took a look at them and acknowledged that it was an excellent horse and car, so he further assumed that they didn't know how much it was usually worth. So with that in mind, he had suggested 200,000 mar, and immediately Sistine heard that price. She had asked him to raise it because the horse still young and healthy, and at the same time, the carriage was in really good condition. Sistine and the merchant had gone to have a bargaining battle up until the point. He had offered her 290,000 mar, and also stated that he couldn't go any higher than that. After the merchant gave that offer, he acknowledged that this girl had fought back more than he had thought. However, given that he had offered her the price of 290,000, he recalled that he would usually pay 350,000 mar for this kind of horse, so being tired of this constant arguing, he had offered her the sum of 350,000 mar, for which she had instantly agreed to. As they walked away, Saoji remarked saying that it was astounding when he had suddenly said 350,000 mar so suddenly. So she replied saying that she had been offered that amount not because of the merchant's good heart, rather it was because of the negotiation skill she had. She then explained that it was a skill that pulled out the upper limit of how much the other person would go, which was why she had waited for the perfect timing to use that skill. With that being said, Saoji went on to ask her whether he always made use of that skill whenever she negotiated with someone, for which she had replied saying that she didn't always use it, so she further explained that after all, it did look a bit unfair for her, so she had just made use of it for the carriage. Saoji understood this, and as they rode on for a while, Saoji remarked saying that he could see their inn from there, so they could now relax. Shortly after, they arrived at the inn where they were greeted by a receptionist who let them know that if they wished to stay there, it would 20 mar per room, after which she asked whether they wanted 2 rooms, for which Sistine and Hotaru had confidently stated that they wanted only 1 room. Then after the accommodation had been sorted, Saoji suggested that they went to get some food in the meantime, and at that point they all acknowledged that they could now get some rest after that long journey. Then in the next moment, they had gotten some alcoholic drinks, for which Sistine was surprised to see that this was the alcohol that Hotaru had spoken of so much. Saoji then replied saying that it was fermented alcohol, and with that in mind, he had heard that it was a rather popular drink in this world. At that same moment, Saoji remarked saying that Hotaru was so cute when she couldn't stop complaining about wanting to drink some alcohol, for which she replied saying that she wasn't complaining, but rather she was just negotiating. In the next moment, she took a sip and squealed while saying that the alcohol just tasted so good, and at the same time, the sauteed vegetables also tasted really great. Subsequently, Sistine stated that now they could relax. She wished to talk about the duty that had been given to them, which was to explore the tower. Saoji and Hotaru were confused by this, so Satina went on to explain that the tower was simply a building that was filled with monsters, and since ancient times, it had been known that there were 10 towers, and for that fact, monsters were endlessly created inside that tower. But when the tower was full, these monsters would start leaking from that tower, and as a result, it was a well-known fact that 3 towers were destroyed in the past. Since then, there had been no monsters spotted around those areas, and with that, those areas were blessed with prosperity. Because of that, each city continued trying to subjugate these towers to gain safety and prosperity. Then after this explanation, Saoji then remarked saying that it wouldn't be that bad if they had to try visiting those towers. Hotaru took another gulp of alcohol whilst she stated that it would be good training for Saoji, and also, she added that she would be sure to train by experience real battles. Shortly after, Saoji had a towel around his waist while he remarked saying that it truly did look like a bath, but for some reason, to him, it seemed a little lacking. Sistine had never seen a bath like this and was even unaware of what a bath was in the first place, so she went on to ask whether it was something delicious owing to the fact that she had never heard of anything like that before. At the same time, Isekai'd was feeling a little down because he wanted to take a dip in the bath, but at the same time, he would rather not do it alone. Rather, he wished for the company of Isekai'd and Hotaru. However, there wasn't really that much of a chance for that to happen so he just decided that he was just going to enjoy the bath with Sakura for now. At the same time, he remarked saying that he really hoped that Sakura would soon turn into a human as well. About half an hour later, and while Isekai'd was done with him bath and had gotten dressed, he observed that Hotaru had just come out of the bath herself, so in the next moment, he went on to ask her how her first bath at this inn was, for which she replied saying that it wasn't bad at all and also very refreshing, and at the same time, it would have been much better if the bath had some hot water. Then this statement from Hotaru made him want to get in a hot spring bath one day, for which Hotaru replied saying that it seemed that she would be looking forward to what he could do. Subsequently, Hotaru had stood up, which made Isekai'd that she was just about ready to leave, for which she replied saying that she wished for them to have a quick training session until Isekai'd got out of the bath. Following that, Hotaru stated that they would use half of the room for the training session, and Hotaru had strong eye contact with Isekai'd while she let him know that the aim would be for him to try to reach for her chest. At the same time, she mentioned that she wasn't going to make it easy for him because she would use half of the room to evade his hands. Isekai'd then took a hard glance at her watermelons while almost drooling, and in the next moment, he had let Hotaru know that he had gladly accepted her challenge. So with all that being said, the challenge had begun. Then for the next couple of moments, Isekai'd had tried reaching for Hotaru's attacks while she evaded them while making use of half the room, and in subsequent moments, he remarked saying that he was getting the hang of moving swiftly around. However, he realized that it would most efficient if he let his natural body instinct to lead her to her coconuts rather than second-guessing his movements every couple of seconds. Just then, the receptionist had walked in and observed this, so she went on to yell while asking them both what the hell they were doing, so as she had stopped them. Hotaru told Isekai'd that their little training session had now come to an end, after which, Isekai'd went up to Hotaru and shook hands with her and thanked her for the training. After this, Hotaru remarked saying that Isekai'd's movements weren't all so bad when he was focusing on his worldly desire. So with that, she urged him to try to remember those moves in his daily life. So in response to that, Isekai'd thought of it to be kind of weird that she would his worldly desires to train him. Just then, Isekai'd had gotten out of the bath and walked in to see Isekai'd and Hotaru shaking hands in the middle of the room. So she went on to calmly ask them what the hell they were doing. After that, Isekai'd apologized for making them wait for so long, and as Isekai'd stood by him, Isekai'd stared at her coconuts and mentioned that they appeared to be really shiny to him, so not wanting to look a creep, he suggested that all went back to the inn. Shortly after, Isekai'd jumped on the bed while stating that he could finally relax himself. Isekai'd walked in and stated that it appeared that Hotaru would stay back to have some more drinks in the cafeteria. After which, Isekai'd called Isekai'd by the name Master and suggested that she helped him take his clothes off. She then sat down on the bed and proceeded to remove his coat, all while stating that although their plan was to buy equipment the next day, she had gone to buy something today. At that point, Isekai'd was so lost in the conversation that he didn't realize that Isekai'd had been taking his clothes off the entire time, called the fact that she was taking of his clothes. So he went on to ask her what she was doing with a surprised look on his face, for which she had replied saying that it was her duty as his acolyte to dress him. And coincidentally, Isekai'd had shifted her weight the wrong way, and had subsequently fallen on top of Isekai'd, and in the next moment, they both had exchanged saliva. Isekai'd was still a bit shocked this behavior from Isekai'd. Meanwhile, Isekai'd sensed his shock and was led to assume that he didn't want to do it with her, for which Isekai'd replied saying that wasn't true at all, so in the next moment, they proceeded to exchange saliva yet again. After that, Isekai'd told Isekai'd not to do this with her solely because she was contracted to him, so in response to that, Isekai'd had hugged her tightly and went on to harvest her farm tree. After this farm plantation was done, they both laid in bed while Isekai'd stated that he had just gone with the flow and did it. So in the next moment, he went on to ask Isekai'd how she was after what they had just done. Following that, Isekai'd replied saying that he shouldn't just worry about it because she would take care of the contraception. Thereafter, Isekai'd suggested that they went to meet with Hotaru, for which she had agreed to. Shortly after, they had gone downstairs to see Hotaru enjoying some drinks of the fermented alcohol they all had taken earlier. Hotaru took a look at them and sensed that they were really overjoyed, so she went on to state that it appeared that they both had really enjoyed themselves. for which Saoji had lightly chuckled while mentioning that he really couldn't hide anything from her. Subsequently, Hotaru stated that she would be heading back to the room soon, but went on to suggest that Saoji and Sistine went on to have another bath meanwhile. Following that, Hotaru went on to whisper into Saoji's ear while telling him she would be staying in her blade form that. Then immediately after that, she had walked away while stating that she would head back to the room first, so they both should just enjoy themselves. Then as they were in the bath, Sistine had asked Saoji whether she would like for him to wash his back, all while wearing towels to cover her private parts. The moment Saoji saw her attire, he instantly remarked saying that her outfit was a real treat for his eyes. However, Sistine felt really embarrassed to have been so naked in such a bright bath. So with that in mind, she had a bright blush on her face. Then as she washed his back, Saoji was getting teased a little too much at the fact that her watermelons were pushing at his back while she bathed him. So at that point, Saoji couldn't resist his urges anymore and had literally taken matters into his own hands. Then after that, they had gone on yet another plantation escape. Then after they were finished, they both laid in bed. However, Saoji wasn't quite satisfied yet, so he attempted to touch Sistine, who was asleep. But right he could do it, Hotaru had appeared and told him to stop that shit, and also that he looked really pathetic doing that. Following that, Hotaru stated that she would have Sistine teach him about magic the next day. So with that being said, he urged Saoji to let her rest for the moment. However, Hotaru considered Saoji's desperate condition, so she had offered him herself to get himself satisfied, for which Saoji was really glad to both see and hear. Then the next morning when he had checked his status, Saoji noticed that his rank had gone up significantly, and further reasoned that it was most likely because of his vitality. Following this, Sistine was a bit shocked to find out that Hotaru's status had gone up, for which Hotaru went on to mention that she had just woke up and her body felt lightened. After that, she had opened her display window and she herself was surprised to see she was now on rank S++. Sistine was surprised to hear that she was on such a high rank, and in the next moment, Hotaru further stated that it didn't end there, for the new skills she had gotten also had a plus in front of them, and to top it all off, she went on to show them that she had gotten a new skill that was known as Vigor Absorption, which had a value of 15. At first, Sistine didn't understand what this was, but she had later realized Hotaru had developed this new skill because Saoji had done it rough with her last night. Subsequently, Hotaru went on to explain that the Vigor Absorption value was actually about Saoji's banana cream, so she further acknowledged that after she had collected it last night, her rank had gone up. So with that being said, Saoji then stated that he now understood what the magic vigor conversion was. Then in the final moment of this talk, Sistine had a shy look on her face while she begged Saoji to sometime do her as rough as she had done with Hotaru. Just then, Saoji noticed that Sakura began to vibrate, so Saoji went on to inquire about what was wrong. In the next moment, Saoji stated that he sensed that Sakura was feeling sorrowful, and went on to wonder whether what she felt at moment was regret. He subsequently acknowledged that Sakura had a high vigor absorption value because she was exposed to a lethal dose of his blood. Now that he realized that, he urged her not to worry about it. He then pampered her while saying that she should just focus on growing until she would be able to talk. Now that Hotaru thought about it, this meant that magical power now flowed inside of her body. Sistine agreed to this while she stated that magic was the process of draining magical power out of the body and giving it to an image to become a phenomenon. However, she also acknowledged that people didn't naturally have the ability to visualize things in a way that would make them materialize in real life. She further stated that this was precisely why they needed a systematization of light magic and recovery magic as well. Hotaru understood this and went to demonstrate this by making the room brighter with the light magic. Saoji thought of this to be really cool, so he had decided to give it a try as well. However, all his attempts were to no avail, and at that moment, Sistine was surprised to see that even though he had more magic than the average person, he wasn't able to use it. So in the next moment, Hotaru had grabbed him and told him not to worry about it and further stated that he already had an extraordinary magic skill. Then in the next moment, Hotaru had whispered in Saoji's ear while stating that when he had used his magic vigor conversion last night, it was so good that she thought she was going to break, so she went on to tell him that from then on, he was going to be sharing it with her in quantity each night. So after that, Saoji stated that he was really pumped up now, and subsequently that they would go get some equipment today, and then capture the tower the next day. After they had gotten their equipment, Saoji was a bit surprised to see that Sistine had chosen an axe hammer as her weapon of choice. And at the same time, Saoji had decided to go with Sakura and busted sword that he had recently picked up. and after he had gotten the sword, he stated that he would someday give it a name. So after that was all done and later that, they had all decided to innocently go to bed since they knew that they would be heading to the tower the next day. Then the next day they had set out and shortly arrived at a place that seemed to be a transfer point. They walked until they reached a guard standing at the entrance of the tower. So with that, Sistine went on to introduce herself as an acolyte and further informed him that they wished to go into the tower, so they would like to use the transfer point. Once the guards understood this, they had instantly opened the gates with no trouble whatsoever. In the next moment, they had entered and were amazed to discover that beautiful decor was indeed the transfer point. As they entered, Saoji noticed a cute little receptionist and also the erotic outfit that she had put on. So with that in mind, he went on to drool while having several sus things going on in his mind. Subsequently, the receptionist handed them a card while saying that in case they were to return to the city after the tower's exploration, it would cost them 1,000 mar. This card she handed Saoji was a wooden tag. She subsequently informed him that they would just need to sell one or more of their magical stones whenever they were to return and buy it back for the 1,000 mar. Saoji understood and went on to state that the people that came there could sell their magical stones in this place as well. Just then, Saoji noticed some armored guys walking in, so he went on to state that it seemed like there were some returnees who were just getting back from there. Saoji took an even clearer look at them and assumed that they must be adventurers, and at the same time, now that he thought about it, he went on to wonder whether these were the others who could make use of the brief appraisal skill. In the next moment, they all acknowledged that this was a Tsukimi Maker party, and at the same time, they knew that it would be best if they just didn't get themselves involved. Following that, one of the adventurers had walked up to Saoji while pushing him aside and persuading both Sistana and Hataru to ditch Saoji and come along with them, for which they had very serious-looking faces while they had kindly refused. After they had refused, the adventurers accepted their defeat. As they walked away, Hataru remarked saying that the guy who had asked them out was a really troublesome person. So with that in mind, they suggested that they should change their base point to not see him again. After that, they had finally gotten to the transfer point, where Sistine stated that the transition room had the same layout as it did. She also added that the crest above that door was intended to change, so until it changes, she urged them not to get out of that point, for which Saoji had understood. So with that being said, they were now ready to be transferred. Shortly after, they had been transported to an area surrounded with a lake, so with that, they had decided to start their adventure. At this point, Saoji's party had finally left and gone inside the tower. Then a few moments after being inside, Hataru stated that she could sense some monsters ahead. So with that in mind, they all thought that they would test Sistine's strength, so Saoji and Hataru urged her to go ahead and attack the monster. Then Sistine had brought out her giant battle axe, and with that, she was now face to face with the monster. In the next moment, she had began to exchange blows with the wolf, and after a few seconds of them fighting, there happened to be a huge opening for Sistine to land a heavy blow, and Saoji saw it too, so he held her name while advising her to take the final swing. But to his surprise, Sistine had just stood still and didn't seize the opening. Saoji was shocked as to why she just stood there, but Hataru had then told him not to worry and also that she was doing the right thing. Then in the next moment, Sistine adjusted her footing, and as the wolf beast charged at her, she had instantly made use of her battle axe to beat the shit out of the monster. After it had been killed, she apologized to Saoji and Hataru for having them witness something too lethal, for which Hataru stated that it was something to be quite proud of. Subsequently, Saoji let Sistine know that he noticed that she had an opening to attack the monster, so he went on to ask her why she had waited and not attack at that moment, all for which Sistine replied saying that she felt that if she had attacked it at that instant, the monster most certainly would have dodged her blow. At the same time, Hataru commended her by saying that she had done a really good job of remembering he roll right there at that instant. Saoji was hella confused as to what Hataru meant by roll. So Sistine went on to explain that her techniques were known as self-defense and escorting, and simultaneously, she was naturally good at defending rather than attacking. Sistine held her forehead while she stated that she had suddenly got a surge in strength just by remembering that she had made a contract with her master. So because of that, she had lost track of what she was doing. And at that point, Saoji had fallen in love with just how powerful Sistine was, but Hataru had dragged him by the collar while telling him to save all of that for later. Following that, Hataru mentioned that it would be Saoji who would have the next turn in defeating the monsters, for which he was really pumped up about. To add to that, she stated that she was going to lead the monsters' location, so they should just walk on a little more. They walked until they had reached an empty reach for which Saoji had considered to be a really wide area even though when he had seen it from the outside, it looked like a 3-floor building. and at the same time, the wideness and height of the inside was quite different from what he had expected. Simultaneously, he couldn't believe that it wasn't even possible to get to the entrance area from any floor by climbing down the window. Subsequently, Sistine stated that there were still many mysteries around the tower, but on each floor, there was a boss monster, and once it was defeated, they would be able to head to the next floor. But when their numbers of defeated monsters increases, a new boss would appear each time. However, the tower master resided on the last floor, and if they were to defeat him, the tower would most definitely collapse. Similarly, this tower was known as the selective type tower, so with that in mind, it always started at the first level, and every time the level went up a level, the devils would most undoubtedly be stronger. So to get to the next floor, someone in the party would need to reach the next floor. Saoji was really confused about all of this, so he went on to ask why these towers existed in the first place. Just then, Hotaru had alerted Saoji and told him that there was another monster incoming, and right before he went into battle, she told him to remember the footwork that she had taught him and also keep calm. Saoji then drew his sword and also acknowledged that he was going to be fighting with added weights just to add gravity. So with that in mind, he knew that this wasn't going to be the same as with the bandits earlier. In the next moment, the wolf monster had charged at him, but luckily for him, he had managed to dodge monster attack which had made it head directly for Hotaru. But in response to that, Hotaru had slapped the shit out of him and told it that she wasn't its opponent, but rather Saoji was. At that point, Saoji realized that letting the enemy go behind him like that indicated just how much of a failed vanguard he was. Then in the next couple of moments, Saoji had unexpectedly gotten his ass kicked by the tower wolf, and in fact, it reached the point where he had almost gotten bitten by the wolf. But right before this had happened, Hotaru had realized that it just couldn't be helped, so she had no choice than to help him out a little. As she rushed towards it, she urged Sistine to keep the monster busy for a while, but at the same time not kill it, for which she had instantly hurried to do. Meanwhile, Saoji laid on the floor while Hotaru walked in on him and asked him why he was so stiff in his movements, for which he replied saying this was an actual master, and at the same time he wasn't even capable of hitting a dog in his former world. So to him, this was most likely the cause of it. So as Saoji held Sakura, Hotaru also held his hand while stating that she was going to help him change his manner of thinking. Subsequently, she stated that he had already heard it from Sistine that the monsters were apparently being released by the tower, so because of that, the monsters that weren't being killed there would come out from LP's tower. Then after she stated this, she asked him what he thought was going to happen next, for which he had replied saying that since they were talking about monsters, they would easily kill humans without the slightest restraint, so if monsters were people, they would still be considered as criminals. Now that his mindset had been corrected, Saoji had firmly grasped his sword while having a complete change of mood, so at that sight, Hotaru knew that he would fight to his fullest, so she then urged him to do his best against it, after which, and in a cold John Wick voice, Saoji had told Sistine that it would be okay for them to switch places now. Saoji stared at the wolf while assuming that he was quite the nosy one and also that he was angry because things didn't work out the way he wanted. However, Saoji now didn't really care about that and went on to slash the tower wolf while showing absolutely no mercy. After Saoji had been able to defeat the tower wolf, Sistine remarked saying that his movements had been entirely different from before. So as he walked away from there, Hotaru remarked saying Saoji was a really interesting man. Then in the next moment, Saoji had gone up close to Hotaru while thanking her for helping him grasp the right fighting mindset. At the same time, he went on to state that if it hadn't been for Hotaru's advice, neither he or Sistine would have fought the way they did. Then subsequently, Hotaru went even closer to his face while saying that she would make sure to receive his gratitude that night in the bedroom. Shortly after, Sistine had wandered off a little and discovered something rather interesting, so she had gone on to draw the attention of Saoji while stating that the monsters had disappeared, and at the same time, they had left a gemstone behind. Following that, Sistine had asked Saoji to show her his left arm, and once he did, it appeared that she had made use of some sort of magic to heal the arm. Then in the next couple of moments, he remarked saying that his arm didn't really hurt anymore and subsequently went on to thank her for the recovery magic, for which Sistine acknowledged while stating that she would heal him whenever he needed it, but at the same time, she would prefer if he didn't get hurt in the first place. Once it had been healed, Saoji stated that he would make sure to show Sistine his gratitude in the bedroom as well, for which Sistine had a big red blush the moment she had heard it. Just then, they all noticed that some more tower wolves were approaching, so with that in mind, Hotaru had urged her to take the vanguard and begin the attack. Once she had given off a couple attacks, Saoji had jumped over her and launched a swift strike. As they continued to fight, Hotaru stated that she would be telling them what to do if they were having a hard time dealing with the monster. In the next moment, Saoji had made use of his appraisal technique to discover that the two tower wolves were of rank G and H, but the stone puppet was on rank G, so with that being said, Hotaru had drawn her sword and walked towards the wolves, which indicated that she was ready to fight. And as she walked towards the enemies, Saoji and Sistine both reasoned that Hotaru must have been really happy to be able to fight. Shortly after, Hotaru had defeated those monsters with ease. They all reasoned that they must be done with all the monsters on that floor. So with that, they all decided to now head for the second floor. But then, they had heard a voice which urged them to stop and also added saying that they couldn't go to the second floor just like that without something known as a party ring. Meanwhile, Sistine as well as them all were really confused as to who this guy was. Sistine went on to ask Saoji, so he replied saying he would make use of appraisal skill to find out. After he had used it, he discovered that this man was a 37-year-old guy named Wilmark Bays whose profession was solely a traveling merchant. Then in the next moment, Wilmark had stared at them for a while. Following that, he apologized for the late introduction and subsequently mentioned that his name was Wilmark Bays and was a travel king merchant. After which, he mentioned that they were free to call him Will if they wished. The moment Will had said all this, Saoji remarked saying that he wasn't lying because Will had said up to that had exactly corresponded with what he had seen with his appraisal skill. So with that in mind, Sistine asked him to elaborate on what this party ring was exactly, for which she assumed that these party rings must be a real necessity for adventurers, for which Will had confirmed. He then opened a box of these party rings, and the moment he revealed them, he brought out 2 samples and urged them to notice just how much the black stones on them complemented each other so much. For it was a single heavy magic stone that had been cracked and matched. Sistine was a bit confused as to what good any of that would have done in the first place. So Will then went on to explain that with these stones, even if they were to get far away from each other within the tower, if even one of them were to go to the side where the stone was drawn, they would easily be able to get a good idea of where the other was. After hearing that, Hotaru remarked saying that she considered it to be truly useful indeed. So with that in mind, Sistine had asked how much it would be for 3 rings. For which Will had replied giving the outrageous amount of 300,000 yen, which was equivalent to 3 million yen. The moment Sistine heard this, she knew that it was impossible for that to be the actual price. She walked away and signaled Saoji and Hotaru to walk away with them. But as they turned their backs, Will had gone on his knees and begged them to come back. As he drew their attention back, he went to ask Sistine whether she was an acolyte by any chance, for which she replied giving a positive response. So with that in mind, Will had presented them with 3 magic rings for them to use. Will stated that the rings would serve as an investment because he wished to make a quoted connection with them, which meant that in the future, he would most definitely like to ask a favor of them for his Bay's company. Meanwhile, Saoji thought about this and reasoned that it didn't seem to be a bad deal at first glance. However, it was entirely possible that the condition could turn problematic, but they really didn't have a choice. So with all this being said, they had urged Sistine to make a contract with Will. Sistine then brought up her contract screen and reasoned that she was going to be using a contract as an IOU kind of thing. Then at that point, Saoji acknowledged that they were basically buying a bracelet with no string attached. With that, he believed that it would most likely work in their favor. Subsequently, Sistine stated that if this deal were to be broken, the acolyte Sistine would be punished. Saoji was shocked to hear this because he planned on being the one to punish her when they got home, so he urged her to stop making a sacrifice out of herself. Later that night as they laid in bed, Hotaru told Sistine that she shouldn't be considering herself as some sort of human sacrifice and that they were all in this together, for which Sistine had equally apologized for. Subsequently, Saoji suggested that they all went together again to the tower the following day, and in the next moment, Sakura had clicked on the table which indicated that she was feeling really left out, so she went on to hug Sakura while stating that he was going to be counting on her as well. The next morning, Saoji noticed that Sakura's training value wasn't rising at all and was still on rank D even though they've been through so much combat. Hotaru then stretched her hand over to him while stating that was where the magic stone she had kept would come into play. She added that with Saoji's supplemented training skill, he would be able to increase Sakura's stats. He then did just as Hotaru had instructed, and in the next moment, Saoji noticed that Sakura's training value had now gone up to 50. Then at that point, Saoji was really happy to have helped Sakura to have leveled up. So with that, he realized that to keep giving Sakura some nice magical stones, he would need to go to the upper floors and get stronger. After which, he suggested to them both that they should again go to the tower that day. Shortly after, they had arrived at the tower yet again, but their jaws had dropped at sight that the tower appeared to be quite crowded. Just then, Will had appeared and drew their attention. They saw him and went on to ask what the problem was and whether anything had happened. Will then ran over to them and explained that last night he had gone to the first floor as well, but noticed that there was not a single monster in sight. Sistine was really shocked to hear this because she didn't believe that was even possible in the first place. Hotaru then stated that it was most likely because they had wiped out all the monsters that lied on the first floor. Saoji was surprised to hear this, so he went on to ask Hotaru whether it was even possible for them to have hunted down so many monsters that the tower couldn't keep up with respawning. For which she replied saying that she wasn't all too sure up to that extent, but what she was sure of was the fact that the tower was temporarily out of reserves. Subsequently, Will stated that was all well and good, but the main problem had still come afterwards, which was that last night, the adventurers in the tower at that moment had noticed that the party that entered the first floor hadn't come back yet after it was trusted that they were to come back after 1 hour. Following that, another party of adventurers had stated that they were going to take a look just to be certain, and further assured everyone that they would be fine since they had gone up before until the 5th floor. However, those adventurers had returned just on the verge of being crushed, and according to what they had said, it was believed that there were definitely monsters from the 10th floor and above. After hearing this, Sistine's instinctual response was to go and help them out, so with that, she went on to ask Will for just how many people were being trapped there, for which he replied saying that the party that was yet to return had more than 10 people. But in the next moment, he added that he had heard that the number of other monsters was increasing with a mix of the 2nd and 8th floor monsters, and due to the structure of the dungeon, the farther they got to the center of the dungeon, the stronger the monsters were, and at the same time, the fewer the exits there were. Simultaneously, he also mentioned that it was believed that a lot of newbies had been trapped near the center. Then after this narration, Will stated that he was going to go call an experienced party to handle the situation, after which, he urged them to wait there. But Sistine had yelled while saying that they would be ones going instead. And just then, Hotaru had calmly grabbed her from behind and stated that if they were talking about the monsters on the 1st to 8th floor, she believed that they would somehow be able to get by, and further stated that they would be able to get in there while being careful not to step into the boss's area. However, in repose to this, Saoji had coldly disallowed them from doing this while stating that even if though they were partly responsible for this, he didn't have anything or anyone that was as precious to him as they both were to him. So Sistine had then replied saying it that was how it was, she would go in alone. Saoji then stated that wasn't going to allow that, but Sistine had then reminded him that he had overwritten her contract for situations like this, with the contract saying that when the acolyte Sistine dictates it necessary for her own justice and responsibility, it was authorized that she could use her power as she saw fit. Saoji remembered this and went on to drag Sistine by the arm while saying that since he couldn't prevent it, the three of them would be going together instead because Sistine was so important that to him that there was absolutely no way that he was going to let her go in alone. And in the next moment, Sistine had hugged Saoji while thanking him for that decision, and realized that this was indeed the right thing to do because he knew that he wanted to protect the hearts of all those who were important to him after all. Shortly after, they had arrived at the location where Saoji remarked saying it even looked like a much different place than the one they had gone to the previous day. And at the same time, they noticed that there was something quite different about the air, but despite that, they still had a strong desire to go in and rescue all those who needed help. Just a few moments after entering the castle, Saoji and Sistine had begun to slay the first round of monsters that had come their way. They had done this with somewhat ease, so they gave each other a high five and Saoji began to believe that they would be able to make it work. But just then, Hotaru had drawn their attention and informed them that a much more formidable opponent was approaching, so they shouldn't let their guard down. Shortly after, they had observed some giant lion-like monsters with fangs, and they were shocked to have seen this because these were a type of monster that they had never seen before. In that moment, Saoji went on to ask Hotaru whether she would be able to handle two of them at the same time, for which she replied saying that she would be able to take care of the two on the side. But she then that he and Sistine would have to keep the last one busy until she was done with the other two. Then as Saoji fought the Tower Flame Fang alongside Sistine, he recalled that he needed to stay calm as he had been told and at the same time protect Sistine since he was the vanguard. Just then as they fought, Saoji observed an opening against the Tower Fang, so he immediately rushed at it with his sword with the intent of absolutely slaughtering it. However, in that same moment, the Fang had almost instantly countered his attack. Saoji then acknowledged that it had read his plan and completely charged at him, the gang pushing harder and harder towards the ground. So Saoji then realized that it was way too strong for him, and if things continued at that rate, he would most likely end up as dog food. But just then, Sistine had come to his rescue and proceeded to swing her huge battle axe at it, which sent it flying and hit against the wall. After this, Sistine helped Saoji up and went on to inquire about his condition, for which he had replied saying he was alright, and at that point, they both acknowledged that the gang had taken a considerable amount of damage, so they had then decided to finish it off together. But just as they had decided to collectively launch an attack on it, they soon found out the hard way that it had fire breath magic. The fire was just about hitting Sistine, but fortunately, Saoji had jumped in and helped her to avoid the fire. However, Sistine noticed that Saoji still took some damage, so she knew that she needed him to heal like really quickly. Then in the next moment, Hotaru had jumped in and kicked the Fang in the gut, after which she told her to heal him later, and at that moment, help her take the monster down. So with that being said, she had told Saoji to hold on for the moment and that she would soon be back. And as Saoji crawled on the ground, he acknowledged that this was indeed a different world than the one he was used to, because fire breath and stuff like that were really dangerous. Following that, Saoji had heard the voice of a person who inquired about his condition while telling him that he could have easily. This person appeared to be a girl, and in the next moment, she had helped him up while mentioning that there was a safe haven that was not so far away from there. So she took him there in hope that they would be a bit safer than they were over there. And she dragged him. She recalled that there were some small holes that monsters couldn't get into. So with that in mind, she reasoned that would be a good hiding spot for them. Shortly after, she had brought him to a hole that was filled with a bunch of wimpy adventurers that were too scared to face the monsters, after which she apologized to Saoji for it being a little too cramped up, and to add to the unfortunate events, they had just used up the last of their recovery medicine. But the moment Saoji saw these adventurers, he instantly that these were the 10 adventurers that hadn't been about to escape, so at that point, he was just really glad that he had found them. Meanwhile, Sistine and Hotaru continued to attack the Tower Fang with all they had. However, it didn't seem to be enough because the Fang wasn't even slowing down in the slightest. So, with that in mind, they went on to repetitively fight the Fang with no aim. Just then, the Fang had charged at her. But a few moments before it had hit, Hotaru's foot had hit Sakura, who just happened to be laying on the ground right next to her. So as the Fang approached her, she picked Sakura up and proceeded to deliver an extremely heavy blow to the Fang's stomach. This stab to its stomach had caused it to finally die out, and after which, Hotaru acknowledged that it was now over. Following that, Hotaru told Sistine that they should hurry over to help Saoji, for which Sistine instantly agreed to, and as they went, Hotaru thanked Sakura for the serious help she had rendered back there. Subsequently, Saoji had woken up with 2 huge watermelons on top of him. Apparently, he was currently resting on Sistine's. Then the moment she saw his eyes had started moving, she then looked down at him while asking whether he had regained his consciousness. She acknowledged that he was fully conscious now and went on to call Saoji a dumping dumbass for getting himself that hurt just so that he would cover for her. Furthermore, she stated that these were injuries that an acolyte should have easily recovered her master from. But in response to that, Saoji had told her that she was mistaken for saying such because he felt that she would only be able to treat his wounds because she was unhurt. Following that, Sistine had informed him that she was going to be taking his clothes off so he should kindly endure the pain. So with that in mind, she took off clothes and proceeded to pour a healing potion all over his back, and as she poured it, he remarked saying it stung him a bit but still felt good. After the healing was done, Sistine went on to state that if it hadn't been for her selfishness back then, she would have been able to heal him and he wouldn't be that hurt. After which, Saoji calmly replied saying that it was apparently all thanks to Sistine that they had been able to find those people, and that alone was good enough for him. Following that moment, Hotaru had walked up to Saoji while handing him something and telling him to take a look at it. He took a look and Hotaru went on to explain that it was a magic gem that the previous monster had left behind. Now that he had realized, Saoji went on to exclaim at the fact that this was a really rare fire magic gem and further wondered whether it was normal for monsters to have dropped this kind of thing. Just then, the girl who had dragged Saoji away from the battlefield had remarked saying what Saoji had in his hands was a really amazing mutant gem. The moment that had been said, Saoji immediately recognized that voice to be the one of the girl who had saved him earlier. He then took a closer look at her and proceeded to make use of his Riz Justu technique on her by saying he considered the fact of finding such a cute girl in a place like that to be really unique, for which she had blushed in response to that while saying that he must have recovered well enough if he was able to joke around like that. Just then, the girl looked at Saoji and asked him whether he thought of her to be one of those weird mutants just because she was a female explorer. In addition to that, she went on to mention that the flame fangs usually appeared on the 7th floor, which Saoji knew was true because that was exactly the same thing that his appraisal technique had said. To add even more that, the girl stated that in terms of size of the heat of the flames, the ones they fought was on a different level from the rest. They all were surprised to have heard this, so they went on to ask her whether all that was true, for which she replied giving a positive response and also mentioning that it was quite a normal thing to see flame fangs like that one using ranged spells and blaze attacks, and at the same time, after they had gone past the 10th floor, and even then, it was considered fairly rare to see them. After she was done with the explanation, Saoji didn't really care about that, but was a little upset that he had ignored his riz, so with that in mind, he went on to remind her that he wasn't joking when he had called her a cute girl. So at that moment, she had successfully been rizzed up and went on to thank him for the compliment. Following that, he went on to ask her whether she could tell him more about this mutant magic gem, for which she had hesitantly replied giving a positive response. So with that being said, she explained that mutant monsters left behind unique and valuable magic gems which could easily be sold for a fortune, and at the same time, these monsters were far stronger than the rest of their kind, so normally, people's first instinct was to run away after seeing one, for which they all understood. Then after that, Sistine let Saoji know that she was done with his healing, for which he had thanked her for. Following that, he asked her to kindly heal all the other explorers too, at least until they were able to walk by themselves. So Sistine understood this instruction from Saoji and went on to let him know that she have that done immediately. In the next moment, Saoji realized that this mysterious girl hadn't introduced herself up until that point. So he went on to ask her what her name was, for which she replied saying that her name was Frey, and further added that she usually explored around the 4th floor, but she had come there on an escort quest. Now that Saoji knew her name, he let her know that she had a favor to ask of her, which was to take the others along with her and escape. So in response to that, Frey bowed while stating that she would do as he had asked, but before that, she mentioned that she would like to know his name. So with that in mind, Saoji went on to introduce himself to her while telling her that he was really grateful for doing as he had said and at the same time would somehow pay back the debt. Just then, Hotaru grabbed Saoji's head and shoved his face in between her 2 cheesecakes while telling him that they had already said too much by mentioning the magic gem, so it would be a much smarter idea for them not to provoke any more jealousy, which when Saoji heard, realized that Hotaru had a pretty good point. He looked back at the guy with a wolf cut and remarked saying if that was the case, he believed that they would have to be especially wary of that wolf cut guy. Just then, that same guy had drawn Frey's attention, and from the manner which he had called her, it was presumed that he was the one who had hired her. The guy then called for her, but she hadn't answered him that time simply because she was unable to hear him. So in the next moment, and to everyone's surprise, he had dragged Frey by the hair and yelled at her for not being able to answer him when he had called. After which, he had forcefully grabbed one of her cheesecakes while telling her not to forget her place. So after this had happened, Frey had a quite depressing look on her face while she apologized to him. Right before that dude could deal any more damage, Saoji had grabbed his arm while it was still in the air. Then with a cold look on his face, he told that guy that he had better get out of there if he knew what was good for him. And apparently, that dude was a huge coward, so he got really intimidated by Saoji's words and proceeded to run away while crying his eyes out. Following that, Saoji had gone down on one knee and went on to inquire about condition while offering her his hand to help her up. Then at first, she had a bright blush on her face. Then in the next moment, she had sudden change in mood and had refused the hand that Saoji offered her while stating that she was capable of helping herself up. Shortly after, she stood up and had left with her presumed master, but from the look she had on her face as she left, Saoji was certain that she wasn't happy about the decision she had just made. Then after they had left, Saoji remarked saying that Guy had treated her as if she were his slave or something. So what he just saw made him wonder whether a mere quest giver was even allowed to treat someone like that in the first place. Then putting that aside, Hotaru's had asked Saoji for what their next move since they had already fulfilled their primary objective, which was to help the adventurers escape. Then at the next moment, Sistine remarked saying that she was aware of the fact that they had already done enough and had been able to save enough people. So with that in mind, she remarked saying that they should leave as well. Saoji was surprised at this statement from Sistine and considered it to be quite ironic because she was the one who so insistent of them going into the castle in the first place. Following that, Saoji went on to ask Hotaru whether she could sense any more people ahead, for which she had given a positive response for while mentioning that there were about 2 or 3 people that were near the floor boss area. So with that being said, Saoji had stated that would be the next place that they would be heading. Immediately Sistine had heard this, she disagreed with this because she felt that they had already done enough, after which she stated that she was wrong to have forced them into the tower because the 2 of them were the most important people in the world to her. So with all that being said, she proceeded to beg Saojiro not to go any further. But in response to that, Saojiro had just coldly replied saying no because he didn't think of escaping to be that good of an idea. And also, this was simply not to the time for it. Subsequently, Saoji reasoned that Sistine had taken this decision out of fear of him getting hurt, so at that point, he knew that if he let her get away with it, he would definitely be making a mistake. Simultaneously, he also realized that what motivates Sistine to act was her desire, and also to use her strength as an acolyte for someone else's sake. However, what was motivating her at the time was not that desire, but rather the fear of losing him and Hadaru, which was exactly why he felt that he couldn't let her run away in such a state. Meanwhile, in the midst of all this, Hadaru had told Sistine to get a grip of herself and stop acting like a stranger, after which she told her to imagine if she was the one in their place. Hadaru believed that she would also put her life on the line for their sake without a second thought. As Sistine considered that scenario, Hadaru mentioned that this was exactly the same, so with that in mind, she urged her to just think of it to be her turn to get spoiled. And at the same time, Saoji had a bright smile on his face while he stated that he wouldn't go that far just to spoil her. Sistine then thought about this for a few seconds and then confidently stated that she wished to save them, after which she had asked them both whether they lend her a hand to complete this task, for which Saoji had given a very positive and confident reply. So with that being said, they began their journey. And as they walked, Hadaru mentioned that it looked like that flame fang they had fought earlier was monopolarizing the area because she had noticed that there didn't seem to be that many monsters around. So with that in mind, she believed that they might even be able to find the other explorers without having to fight. Just then, and contrary to what Hadaru had just said, he had realized in that moment that she had just sensed a monster ahead. Then subsequently, she let Saoji and Sistine know about it and then urged them to run to the location before it happened to be too late. As they drew closer, they were able to hear screams of agony coming from behind a corridor. Then from just how agonized the screams were, Saoji went on to presume that they were too late. But Sistine then remarked saying that we're not yet late because as long as they could hear the victims' voices, there was still some form of hope. Then in the next moment, Saoji had spotted it, so he alerted the others while telling them that they had made it in time. So with that being said, they all charged at it while having decided that they were going to take it down in order to save as many lives as they could. They stared down at this monster, and it was soon discovered that it was a monster from the 12th floor. So with that in mind, Hadaru had dashed towards it and let off a huge slash at its direction. And at that same moment, Saoji was surprised to see that the monster had complete dodged her attack. Now that he saw this, he decided that he was going to attack it as well. So while he was bare-chested, he ran towards the monster with a potent fire in his heart. But then, after a while, they both had noticed that the monster had completely disappeared. Hadaru then urged him not to be surprised because it was just making use of a camouflage. And with that being said, she further told him go left and also keep his guard up. Then in the next moment, the bear monster had launched an attack on Saoji while he was still in hiding, which sent him flying into a nearby wall. And once this had happened, Hadaru remarked saying on top of being able to change its colors, it was also capable of erasing its presence. Subsequently, Hadaru had instructed him not to focus on a single point and look at the entire place. Then as Saoji laid on the ground, he noticed that Sakura was getting hyped up as he held her in his hands, and went on to wonder why she was getting so hyped up at a time like that. Just then, as the monster continued to move and time went on, Saoji remarked saying that he had noticed that the space the bear monster appeared to have filled appeared to be distorted. Then as he continued to fight, Saoji was able to see just how the space got distorted when it moved. And now that Hadaru was holding it off, he reasoned that he now had a chance to put this all to an end. Then as Hadaru held off the bear for a while, Saoji had jumped over her while launching an overhead sword attack on the bear monster. Then in the next moment as the sword connected, Saoji had been able to behead the monster. After which, the bear monster had fallen. But Saoji was unaware that he had been the one to cut off the bear's head, so he went on to commend Hadaru for a job well done. However, Hadaru then replied informing him that she was only able to cut off a hand, but Saoji had been the one to cut off its head. Saoji was a bit surprised to hear this because he felt that his bastard sword wasn't even able to put a scratch on it. But putting that aside, Saoji reasoned that he couldn't just keep on calling it a bastard sword and had to give it a proper name, for which he decided to do in his free time. Following that, Saoji went on to inquire about the condition of the people that were being attacked. So with that being said, Sistine had replied saying that they had been able to save 2 people. These 2 people consisted of a boy and girl who introduced themselves as Tor and Ari respectively, all while thanking them all for the help they had rendered. now that they considered the fact that there were only 2 of them to be saved. This made them realize that they hadn't arrived in time. They then looked at a bloody and injured guy who sat down towards the wall, and the moment Hataru had seen him, she remarked saying that they could have him if they had arrived a little earlier, and subsequently, she judged that from the injuries he had, there was no saving him at all. Tor then referred to that guy as Baku and remarked saying that he had risked his life to save them, and thanks to him they were able to hold on for a little longer. Tor then clenched his fist in anger while he stated that this was all the monster's fault. And at the same time, he further stated that he had never seen or heard of a monster like that before, after which he held Ari by the shoulders and told her that she be rest assured that he was going to protect her, so she shouldn't be reckless when trying to cover for him. He said this because he felt that his life would become absolutely miserable if he were to ever lose her. After he said, Hataru thought in her mind that statement was quite selfish of Tor to make. However, Saoji also thought in his mind as well and replied saying that he didn't really agree with that opinion from her. After that, Hataru further explained that if they were to look out for one another, they would be able to protect and defend each other equally. However, if Tor wished to only protect Ari on his own, this would mean that he would have to be twice as strong to accomplish that, and once he understood that, he remarked saying that was fair enough. At the next moment, they both had realized and were surprised to see that they had been able to communicate in their minds. So at that realization, Hataru remarked saying that if they were to combine the communication and sympathy accord, it looked like telepathic communication was possible. Saoji understood that Hataru was transmitted with her communication, and since he was strongly agreed with what she had said, and as the same, he remarked saying that she had been able to receive his thoughts with the sympathy accord skill, so with that in mind, Hataru had gotten closer to Saoji while saying that it was more of an image than a sound, and at the same time, she and Saoji could now talk privately as much as they wanted. Saoji understood what that meant as well, so he went on to blush heavily. After this, Saoji had asked Tor and Ari whether they had been able to secure the artifacts, for which Tor had replied saying that they really wanted to go back with their weapons, but apparently, they had left everything at the floor's boss domain, and at the same time, all they had left was what they were currently carrying at the moment. So with that being said, Saoji stated that this floor boss domain would be their next destination, so they all proceeded to walk in that direction. As they walked, Tor had a rather disturbed look on his face while he remarked saying to think that a warrior like Baku would end up being eaten by a monster or tower itself was quite unfortunate. Saoji was confused as to what he meant by the tower itself, so he went on to ask how he meant, for which Tor replied saying that any corpse that was left inside the tower for more than half a day ended up being consumed by the tower. Saoji then understood this and went on to state that they were just like walking nutrients inside of the tower's stomach. Just then, Hataru had called for Saoji to come over to her, after which she stated that there were no monsters behind their backs to worry about, so in the next moment, Saoji hurried over to her and went on to inquire about what was going on, for which Hataru replied saying she believed that he might want to handle this. So following that, she let him know that there was someone approaching around that corner. Then in the next moment, this person had emerged and Saoji was surprised to see that it was Frey, who had a bright smile on her face while she called out his name the moment she saw him. At this point, Saoji wondered whether this reunion with Frey had a deeper meaning or was just a mere coincidence. So with that in mind, Saoji had asked her why she had come back, for which she replied saying she had returned so that she would be able to help her benefactor, and at the same time, she mentioned that all the others were able to get out safely. Jokingly, she then remarked saying she figured that she owed Saoji one as well, so he then asked him to let her help him. All for which Saoji understood and humbly asked her to help them all. Simultaneously, he reasoned that either way, they had already come this far, so they had no choice than to come out together. As they walked together, Saoji mentally communicated with Hataru while asking her whether there was going to be a battle before they got out, for which she had replied giving a positive response while stating that at that rate, they would be fighting at least once more before getting out, so with in mind, Saoji reasoned that it just couldn't be helped. Subsequently, Saoji mentioned to Frey that if they were going to get out together, they should learn how each other fights, for which Frey thought to be a good idea. So with that being said, he stated that first of all, the girl with the battle axe was Sistine, and because of her impeccable defensive skills, she was their vanguard. And next, he stated that the busty girl with the sword was Hataru, and at the same time, she was the one with the highest offensive skills. And subsequently, he remarked saying that he was just a mere ranger because his combat skills were absolutely nothing to write home about. The moment Frey had heard this, she loudly remarked, saying that there was no way that was going to believe that about Saoji, especially after the swift combat movements she had seen him perform. And at the same time, she also didn't think it was possible for him to be able to wield a bastard sword while supposedly having no combat skills whatsoever. Then at that point, Saoji acknowledged that he may have revealed a little too much. So with that in mind, he went on to state that it had all been because Hotaru had been training him. Then after that, Frey replied saying that it was going to be great when he learned some combat skills. Then at the same time, Saoji noticed that Frey happened to be looking down at his crotch. So he went on to cover it while asking her whether she was interested in his crotch for some reason, for which she hastily replied saying that she wasn't looking at that. After she calmed down, she went on to state that it was just that she considered his weapons to be kind of strange. So in response to that, Saoji replied saying that now he thought about it, he fought with 2 swords while swinging them in a really horrendous manner. So at the same time, he went on to warn her to be careful about her positioning, for which she understood while having several drips of sweat on her face. After this, they continued their journey, and as they walked, Saoji went on to wonder whether she had fallen for his act of being a weakling. And at the same time, Frey continued to look at Sakura, for which Saoji just interpreted as her looking at his crotch. However, all this time, Saoji was aware that she was looking at Sakura that entire time, and further went on to wonder whether having a sword like that was truly that strange. Subsequently, Frey mentioned that she had never seen a sword quite like the one that Saoji had. Saoji had replied saying that it's because that sword was a kind of family heirloom, after which he explained to her that this was a weapon that was known as a katana, and it's been his generation for several generations. He further stated that his parents' house was formerly attacked by a group of bandits, and with that, his parents had passed away. Therefore, he stated that was the reason why he couldn't give her the details about that sword. After Frey heard and understood this, he had a sympathetic look on her face while stating that she was sorry to hear that he had a tough time in the past as well, and then went on to apologize for making him remember such things. So from that statement alone, Saoji concluded that she appeared to be a really nice girl, after which he noticed that her statement implied that she had gone through a lot in the past. Saoji went on to ask her about her own sad story. Following that, she went on to state that she didn't wish to brag about her misfortune, so she was going to spare him the details. She then explained that her parents had passed away a long time ago, and at the same time, she had 2 little brothers with very fragile bodies. To add to that, she mentioned that this was just one of the many things that she had been through, and from that statement, Saoji bluntly asked her whether when she said that she was referring to the fact that her employers often assaulted her. All for which Frey had given a positive response to. Following that moment, Frey thanked Saoji for standing up for her earlier, and also apologized for not thanking him while she was in front of her employer. Just then, Hotaru had mentally communicated with Saoji while informing him that the next monster had arrived and was now in front of them. Saoji heard this and replied saying that it had spawned in a really inconvenient place, after which Hotaru mentioned that they were going to clash soon enough, so with that in mind, they both knew that they would definitely have to split up to ensure the safety of everyone. Then in the next moment, Saoji drew his sword very quickly. Frey was surprised as to why he had just done that, so she went on to ask him what was going on. He didn't respond to that, but had just informed Sistine that the monsters were approaching from both the front and back, for which she instantly understood. And in response to that, Sistine had stated that she would be back there the moment she was done, and at the same time, warned Saoji to be careful. In the following moment right before Sistine left, he had told Tor and the rest of them to stay put and not leave that spot. Meanwhile, Saoji had asked Frey to come along with her while informing her that there were monsters coming from there behind, for which she understood and remarked saying that she was ready for battle. In the next moment, they had witnessed an Ant-Man beast which was a 4th-floor monster. Frey saw it and immediately began to worry because she knew that an Ant-Man being in such a place was nothing but bad news. Then in the following moment, she had gathered her courage and told Saoji be careful because this particular monster led the other tower ants. Saoji then acknowledged this was a bit of a problem for them because he reasoned that they should have taken care of the general or soldiers first. Subsequently, Saoji told Frey to kindly draw the 3 tower ants away from there. Then once she had done that, he himself would take down the Ant-Man, all for which she understood. Meanwhile, Saoji reasoned that Sakura would easily be able to pierce the Ant-Man's shell, and subsequently, he further reasoned that this time, they would need to kill the general first, because if they let them pass, they would inevitably kill Tor and Ari as well as attack Hotaru and Sistine. Then at that point, Saoji considered to be absolutely evil, so following that, he had a sudden change of mood while he drew his sword. They both then charged at the monsters, and as they ran, Saoji mentioned that he was going to follow the left flank, after which he urged Frey to go first and attack from the front, for which she had agreed to. Then in the next moment, Frey had revealed her beast claws which she had used to kick the tower ant asses. Then after she was done with one round of them, Saoji was surprised by subsequently acknowledged that this was the power of a beast swordsman. Shortly after, he had joined in the fight himself while stating that he didn't have time to play around with pests. So with that being said, it didn't take them both that long to totally eradicate the monsters. After they had defeated them all, Frey held her knees while stating that there was even a point where she had regretted coming there to help them. Then in the following moment, Saoji had gathered the magic stones that they had obtained from the ants and then handed them over to Frey while stating that it was all hers. So in response to this, she had politely refused to collect them because she believed that it had been Saoji who killed most of the monster. However, Saoji did well to remind her that she was the one who had kept them at bay the entire time. Frey realized that he technically did have a point, agreed to take it while thanking him with a strangled look on her face. Then in the next moment, Saoji had bent down to pick something that the ant-man had left behind. Then as he was on the ground, Frey had snuck up behind him and used her trash sword to knock Saoji unconscious. Then as he laid there on the ground for a while, he slowly began to regain consciousness. Then the first thing that he had noticed was that Sekiro was no longer on his waist, which led him to believe that it had been stolen by Frey, who just knocked him unconscious. Shortly after, he had gotten up and sensed that Frey was still just around the corner, so with that in mind, he figured that he would be able to catch up to her. Right before Saoji began chasing her, he reasoned that he was never going to forgive her for stealing Sekiro. He believed that she could run and hide all she wanted, but deep down he knew that he was going to find her and make her regret the day she was born. Meanwhile, Frey ran with everything she had while crying her eyes out, and as she ran, she acknowledged that she had done this strictly because she felt that she didn't have a choice and was for a little brother's sake, even if it meant that she would have to betray the one person who had offered her help. So with that in mind, she reasoned that she had no choice other than to steal the sword and the magic gem. Just then, as she thought she had fully escaped, she looked back and noticed that Saoji was running right behind her while mumbling some words to himself. The moment she saw him, she began to cry even more because she believed that he would kill her if he were able to get his hands on her. At the same time, she wondered how he was even able to be conscious at that point because she had hit him with everything she had in her. Simultaneously, she recalled that he was actually a really soft-hearted kind guy and also full of openings for sneak attacks, but yet he had somehow been able to retain consciousness after being hit that hard. However, Frey still didn't believe that she was in the wrong, so she went on to state that it was Saoji's fault for leaving himself so open to attacks. As she continued to run for her life, she noticed that Saoji was getting a lot closer to her, so with that in mind, she began to recall her life's past events, which was that after her partners had passed away when she was little, she and her little brother named Al had managed to survive by taking on various small requests, and at the same time, one of their regular customers named Bart was always polite to them and treated her brother kindly and even gave them food countless times. But when her brother had gotten sick, her life with Bart had changed. From that thought, she even recalled an instance where Bart has stated that he wasn't going to have her little brother treated by a good doctor if she didn't come to his room to do the dirty with him that night. So under the excuse of private guard request, Bart had ordered her around as he wished and also did with her as he wished. And to add to that, he had even embarrassed and stolen from her. So against her will, a man who provoked her in nothing more than repulsiveness. The pain she felt and also all the shame she felt up to that point was Owl for her brother's sake. And despite all that, she had a bunch of tears while she believed that she was going to be killed over some petty thievery. Just then, Frey noticed that she couldn't hear him chasing her anymore, so she believed that she must have outrun him or something of that sort. So with that in mind, she had stopped while she had a rather guilty look on her face, but still believed that she had to deliver it so that she would love able to get some money to take care of her brother and give him better treatment. But to get surprise, she had observed a giant dragon. Meanwhile, Saoji had overheard her while she mumbled the story of her little brother to herself. So at that point, he reasoned that he formerly thought that she was plain evil, but had now realized that it was her little brother's treatment. So with that in mind, he now realized that she had her reasons to have stolen those items from him. Then just as the dragon was about to have Frey as lunch, Saoji had stepped and used his bastard sword to protect her by attacking the dragon head on. After which, he told Frey that he would hear her excuses later. He then urged her to give him the sword Sakura back along with the magic gem, after which she should get the hell out of there. And once she did as Saoji requested, she had proceeded to run in the opposite direction while crying her eyes out. Then in the next moment, Saoji had welcomed Sakura back, after which he had stared down at the giant monster and acknowledged that it was a floor boss, so he figured that he would have to find a way out of the floor before Hataru and Sistani were to return. Then as Saoji stood before it, he had several drops of sweat on his face while he acknowledged that the floor boss was actually really scary. However, despite his fears, he had drawn his sword and proceeded to launch an attack on it, for which the monster had easily countered, which sent Saoji flying into a nearby wall. After this had happened, Saoji wondered how this could have happened because he could have sworn that he had managed to dodge it. Just then, he had looked above him and saw the foot of the giant dragon. However, Saoji didn't consider this to be that much of an obstacle because he knew that he would be able to fight back well. Then in the next moment, Saoji had evaded this attack and countered it by attempting to stab its foot with his blade. However, to his surprise, the blade had refused to stab its flesh. Saoji and the dragon continued to fight for the next couple of moments, and as time went on, Saoji noticed that its movements were actually pretty dull. So with that in mind, he had attempted cutting off one of its arms with Sakura, and this time it had successfully managed to deal some damage. This occurrence had made Saoji remark saying that the swords made in Japan were on a whole other level. However, he also realized that Sakura didn't have that much reach, so it was going to be quite hard to inflict a deep wound on it. So at the same time, he further realized that he would never be able to finish this battle in this way. Following that, the dragon had attempted to slap the shit out of Saoji, but fortunately for him, he had been able to evade it. After this, he wiped his mouth while he said to himself that there was no way that the monster was going to wait for him to attack. But just at that thought, Saoji's 2 brain cells had clicked and he had gotten a sudden idea which he believed might just work. Subsequently, he reasoned that he was closer to the stairs than the boss was, so if he were to just make a run for it and head straight to the 2nd floor, that would make his chances of survival to be even higher. And thankfully for Saoji, the boss's movements weren't only dull, but as they fought, he noticed that it would have to change courses before launching its next attack. So with all this in mind, he had a feeling that this plan might work. Then in the next moment, he realized that he didn't have that much more time to think about it, so he had decided to run towards the stairs with all the leftover strength, in hope that this plan would have a fruitful result. Then as he ran, he assumed that the stairs were approximately 10 meters away, and simultaneously, he didn't sense any changes coming from the floor boss, so with this, he assumed that it was all smooth sailing from there. However, in the next moment, the floor boss had appeared right in front of him and then used one of its thorns to pierce Saoji's torso. After this, Saoji had fallen to his knees while wondering how the floor boss had gotten in front of him without him noticing. Then as he laid on the ground, he thought to himself that something like this had happened in a light novel that he had read a couple of years ago, and in the story, a dragon had been cursed and forced to protect a certain treasure, and it was said that whenever the adventurers were looking for the treasure entered its den, regardless of where it previously was, the dragon would be magically teleported in front of the treasure. So after the dragon had gotten in front of him so quickly, he went on to wonder whether the same principle applied here, so he then acknowledged all that had just happened and remarked saying that he had gotten careless, and then paid the price for it. Just then, Sakura had proceeded to scream his voice, and Saoji had heard this, so he went on to remark saying that he thought he could hear Sakura's voice. Then following that, Sakura had spoke again, encouraging Saoji not to give up at time like this. Saoji then heard this again and was forced to believe that it actually was her voice. In the following moments, Saoji had gone on to wonder how this could have even been possible. So with this in mind, he went on to wonder whether she had ranked up because she was covered in his blood once the dragon had stabbed him. Following this, Saoji had mustered up some strength while saying that he was really fired up now because he figured that he couldn't let himself die right after he had heard Sakura speaking. But in the next instant, Saoji wondered why the dragon wasn't attacking him anymore and had just stayed in one position, for which Sakura had replied saying that her power allowed her to trick an enemy's opponent's eyes for a little bit. So with that being said, Sakura urged Saoji to use this opportunity to eat all the medicine he had in his pouch, for which he had done without hesitation. After a couple of moments, Saoji noticed that he had stopped bleeding, and at the same time, he also realized that the dragon was no longer focusing on him. So with that in mind, he thought of this to be a good opportunity to check out Sakura's new stats, and after taking a look, he discovered that she had obtained some new skills which included mutual understanding and invisibility. The moment he saw this, he smiled at her while stating that he could remember sensing just how hyped up she was when he had that fight with the bear monster. Then putting that aside, now that Saoji understood her skill, he remarked saying that this meant that the dragon couldn't distinguish between him and the walls, so if he played his cards right, He reasoned that he just might be able to make it out all in one piece. However, Sakura went on to state that this was a bad idea because she believed that her powers weren't strong enough for at the moment, and at the same time, if he wasn't careful, it would spot him as soon as he was to enter its field of view. Just then, the dragon had taken a sharp look at him, and at that moment, Saoji remarked, saying that he considered it to be quite ironic that the dragon had found him just as Sakura had finished talking. So with that being said, and without any hesitation, Saoji had jumped into battle while realizing that he just needed to take a big swing and then run into its blind spot. However, as Saoji fought, he began to grow even more weary as time went on, so as a result to that, he noticed that his body was starting to get dizzy, and shortly after, he realized that he was soon going to pass out.